Well, good evening, and thank you for the welcome and earlier introduction. It's a real privilege to be here this evening, and it's something of a pleasure. I think it would probably be a bit more of a pleasure if I didn't have to do the lecture. The man who gave his name to this lecture, John Stott, was one of the eloquent biblical speakers I learned from as a member of the Christian Union, known as KICU at Cambridge University, during my 3 years studying theology there in the late 1970s. And a young man called Chris Wright was one of the other ones. So it's very nice to see how he's got even better in the 35 years since I last sat listening to Chris. And here at London Zoo is where I first saw a giant panda, Chi-Chi, who was one of the inspirations for the original WWF logo drawn by Sir Peter Scott, one of the founders of WWF, which we should be able to see here. You can also see what modern branding consultants have done to the panda. She or he has lost the claws, etc. And you'll also notice what the modern legal profession has done with the insertion of the C and the R in circles. I was able to come to this zoo as a young boy, travelling down by train from my home on the campus of Keele University to see my grandmother, who lived in London. My father was a lecturer at Keele, which is the largest campus university in the UK. And in its early decades, most of the academic staff lived on campus with their families. And so growing up there, especially once all those pesky students had gone away for their long holidays, my friends and I could explore the woods and the fields, the streams and the lakes, the paths and the trails. That's a rather more modern photograph. Most of those buildings weren't there when I was growing up. And so much of my childhood was spent out in nature with my friends. And so we learned about the seasons as we encountered them. We discovered how cold you can get when you fall into a lake, even in the summer. We appreciated the way that ivy holds on to a dead tree so tightly that you can climb all the way up to the top of the old tree. We liked the way that from inside a clump of rhododendron, you can spy out on people walking nearby without them seeing you. And we worked out how much easier it is to get an open-air log fire going if you help it along with some petrol, perhaps siphoned from a pump on one of the university's building sites. Indeed, I remember how upset I got when the expansion of the universities in the late 60s and early 70s intruded on the natural world of the campus. New buildings and roads meant removing some of the woods and trees, and I engaged in some petty vandalism against the builders as a way of hitting back at this destruction of the habitat in which I lived. Now, aided perhaps by being reasonably good at maths, I recall developing a sort of mental tariff system in my mind as to how much damage should be inflicted on the perpetrators' building sites for each tree or area of land that they despoiled. I think this was my first incursion into valuing nature, though I think the government's current proposals for biodiversity offsets are based on enhancing alternative sites rather than merely inflicting wanton damage on the builders. A more positive feature of life at Keele in the 1960s and 70s was that some of the academic departments occasionally laid on events for the staff children who lived on campus. And in particular, the physics department would arrange showings of the official NASA films of the Apollo moonshots. So I grew up inspired by seeing images of humans exploring space and seeing planet Earth from afar. And some people would contend that those images were instrumental in changing our collective understanding of ourselves and our planet. Two images in particular may have helped to accelerate the development of environmental concern. The first is Earthrise. It was taken on Christmas Eve in December 1968 by William Anders, one of the three astronauts. Apollo 8 was the first manned mission to orbit the moon, and this was how the Earth appeared to them at one point as they circled the moon. And so here was a vision of our planet, suspended in space, colourful, beautiful, and small. And so we started to understand that the Earth is not unlimited. And with the technological development of which humans are capable, it is also relatively little and fragile. And the second image is called Blue Marble, taken on the 7th of December 1972 from Apollo 17, the last manned lunar mission. With the sun behind them, the astronauts saw the Earth appearing as a bright blue marble against the blackness of space. Of course, we're now used to seeing those kind of images and satellites can recreate them, but this was the first time that humans had seen that picture. And although usually shown with north at the top of the image, the original orientation was actually more this way up, as you can see here. That's Antarctica at the top. It was taken in December, so there's sun on Antarctica. And so again, perhaps a new way of seeing our planet, a step to helping us see through God's eyes the world which he created. And we typically think of that image as a large image, as you see it now. But in reality, of course, the astronauts would have seen it looking more like this. In my mid-teens, I became extensively involved in a youth group associated with a Methodist church in Stoke-on-Trent. And there, integrating theologically informed evangelical belief with enthusiastic evangelistic outreach, gently charismatic spirituality, and active social engagement, my Christian faith was largely formed there. And I remember that our social action did extend to sorting out the overgrown garden of an old lady who lived in a council house, but there wasn't really much connection of our faith to nature. International disasters and poverty were a much greater focus for our concerns, our giving, and our prayers. Our worries about the planet were focused mainly on its past and its future, rather than its present. So there were impassioned debates about the past, the age of the Earth, and whether it was in fact about 6,000 years old, usually linked to arguments about evolution. So I was interested to read in his recent book, Go to the Ant, written by one of our Rocha's International's trustees, the eminent botanist, Gillian Prance. The denial of evolution as the mechanism of creation troubles me as a scientist who studies the evolution of plants and as a Christian. And he then compares that to the more recent phenomenon of denial of climate change despite the evidence. So we worried about the past of the Earth, and we also worried about its future. We wondered whether it was indeed the late great planet Earth, as the book by Hal Lindsey and Carol Carson put it, in what Wikipedia now describes as, quote, a treatment of literalist, premillennial, dispensational eschatology. Me neither. Even then, I thought this seemed to be a rather bizarre approach to understanding the New Testament. But about the present state of the planet, we thought and were taught little. So why was this? Well, I want to return to that question in a few moments. But before I do, let me take you racing through the decades of my life, or some parts of it at least, in which that slightly rebellious youngster on the Keele campus, the teenager in the Methodist chapel, the Cambridge and Edinburgh theology graduate, developed into the chartered accountant with PricewaterhouseCoopers, the venture capital investor at 3i, the finance director of packaging manufacturer Field Group PLC, and so on. You may be more familiar with some of the other logos there. Now, what does this tell you? Well, one thing it might tell you is he's got a low boredom threshold. Or something. I did stick at tradecraft for about 15 years. So. Now, LICC, which is also one of the sponsors of this evening, of which I'm a supporter, would have quite a lot to say about engaging with my faith in that part of my career, which was in the private sector, working in organisations which were not tackling poverty or corruption or environmental degradation, but providing professional services, risk capital, or quality packaging. But that's probably a subject for another time. I want just to reflect a little on how Christian friends and the Christian community responded to some of the involvements I had in the third sector, the charity sector. So when I became a non-executive director of Tradecraft in 1991, people seemed to think that Tradecraft's mission, fighting poverty through trade, was the kind of thing God would approve of. And I'm very happy recently to have renewed my involvement by becoming a trustee of the Tradecraft Foundation. And when I joined Oxfam in 1997, many Christian friends seemed to perceive this as a particularly appropriate way of living out the Christian faith and serving God. Oxfam's goal, to work with others to overcome poverty and suffering, could indeed be a response to the biblical imperative to care for the poor. So that was Oxfam. Then I moved over here to Transparency International in 2002. Now, most people haven't heard of it, but then I would explain to them that it was the world's leading global coalition against corruption. So that sounded okay. Christians probably thought that work was equally close to the kingdom of God as Oxfam's. God was probably against corruption as well. But when I joined WWF-UK in 2007, although I guess people thought it was just as worthy as some of the previous organisations I'd worked for, to many it seemed rather less connected to Christian faith. Yet WWF's mission, a future in which humans live in harmony with nature, sounds pretty biblical to me. I mean, we might have a debate about whether that's the Garden of Eden before the fall or the new earth of the book of Revelation that Chris was talking about, but either way, it sounds pretty biblical. Well, as my involvement in the world of environmental concern has deepened, I have reflected a bit at least on why that might be, why those reactions. And I've also thought about how we might understand the current ecological crisis, and as a Christian, try to reflect on that from a faith perspective. So let me take you, if you will, on something of the journey that I've been travelling on for the last few years, which started well before I joined WWF, but has intensified while I've been there. WWF is best known, of course, for its work to save charismatic species. And we work to safeguard the natural world. Notice the word safeguard. That implies there must be some kind of threat. Every couple of years, WWF publishes the Living Planet Report, jointly, as you may be able to see up there, with ZSL and the Global Footprint Network. And this reviews what is happening to life on planet Earth. The findings are captured, summarized in two graphs. Here's the first. Let me explain. So we have an index up the side here with an index value 1 here, and we have time along the bottom. And the line is going along and a bit down during that period. This is the Living Planet Index based on counts of some thousands of vertebrate species around the world, which gives an indication of the health of those species. This is rather serious. It's down about 30%, and just to emphasize the issue, if that line there hits the zero line here, everything's dead. Now, we can in fact disaggregate this data into two lines, as shown in this chart. So it's the same index down the side, time along the bottom. This is the temperate living planet index, and this is the tropical. So this is the cooler parts of the world. Those are generally the richer parts of the world, the OECD and so on. And this is the tropical parts of the world. That's down about almost 60%. That's up. So what's going on? Well, we might take some encouragement from this. Conservation, environmental protection legislation and action can work. Species counts can recover. Of course, in many of the temperate parts of the world, we sort of killed off most of the biodiversity, but we are doing reasonably well at protecting what's left. What is scary is this. That's where most of the world's remaining biodiversity is, and it's going down alarmingly. Created life is at risk. To, of course, grossly oversimplify, but there might be two principal causes of this line here. The first is poverty. The time horizon for poor people is shorter. They have to feed the family today. They need to survive this week. But the second cause is affluence, because we are over-consuming the world's stuff. And that is the subject of the second of the two charts in the Living Planet report. So again, we have an index up the side, an index of 1 here, time along the bottom, and this line's going up. Unfortunately, this line going up is not necessarily a good thing. This is trying to measure how much stuff are we humans demanding from the planet, and how much waste are we creating that the planet needs to absorb for us. And we measure that in terms of how many planets do we need. And that's 1 planet, and that's 2 planets. So back in 1961, when WWF was founded, not too bad, about 0.75 planets we needed to provide all our stuff and absorb all our waste. Now, of course, now this is a bit of an issue, because we need about 1.5 planets, and as you may have noticed, we've only just got the 1. We have got something on Mars, but I wouldn't hold out your hopes. Ecological footprint is made up of quite a number of components. So the carbon we emit that needs to be absorbed, croplands for food and feed, grazing land for cattle, fishing, built-up land, and forests. And you can see here how those components have developed over time. One potentially encouraging thing is that that's carbon, and if we take the action we need to anyway for climate change reasons and get that down, then we might be doing quite a lot better at getting things under control. However, this is what business as usual might look like a few snapshots a few years from now, 2030 and 2050. We'd be up to 3 planets by then. So this is somewhat perturbing, because we've now got screens all around the world. Small screens, phone screens, television screens, cinema screens, broadcasting the kind of lifestyles that we live in the West. And those lifestyles, if everybody lived like us, would require us already to need about 3 planets, or if you're from the US, about 5 planets. If everyone is aspiring to that, we've got a pretty serious problem. And this chart, just for those of you who like, charts and numbers and all that kind of thing. If you don't worry too much. But so here we are. This is ecological footprint, actually measured in global hectares. And this is population, and this is the different parts of the world. There's the index. So that's America. So they want quite a lot of hectares per person. That's Asia, not so much. That's sort of Europe here, Latin America, and Africa here. That's in 1961. If we flip forward to a few years ago, 5 years ago, it takes a long time to get all this data worked through. That's what it looks like now. Asia's come up a bit. Africa's now similar to Asia. America is way ahead, and Europe's been growing as well. And just to be clear, that dotted line, that's what's available for one planet. So they might want a bit more, a little bit more, but there's a bit of an issue here. So the threats to nature, to the habitats that sustain all life on Earth, come mainly from us humans. Our activities are now having an effect on a planetary scale. We're dependent for our food, our water, our energy, on the natural cycles which God designed in. But our planet is in a bit of a state. In fact, we might liken our planet to a patient, the third in a family of 8, and a few dwarfs living in the neighbourhood of an unremarkable star. The patient has been admitted to hospital because it's become apparent that this planet is not very well. We might look at some of the symptoms. Alopecia, that's a picture of deforestation in Acre state in Brazil. Leprosy, bits sort of dropping off. That's a picture of a wonderful mining technique known as mountaintop removal in the USA. Open wounds, this is tar sands extraction in Alberta, Canada. To give you a sense of scale, you might just be able to see those are trucks there. You can just about make them out. Dehydration, a bit of a problem there. That's a fish you might just be able to see there. That's in Yunnan province in China. And a problem we've been hearing quite a lot about recently, fever. And over a long period, as we've become more familiar with these facts, that's global average temperatures in the northern hemisphere back about 1,000 years. That's the average between 1960 and 1990, and that's what it looks like. So there's clearly some pretty serious issues going on, and well, you might think perhaps there's some kind of, parasitic infestation that you can see, all this sort of luminescence that appears, light pollution, congestion. Anyway, certainly this doesn't look to me like humans behaving in the way that God calls us to, and is in stark contrast to the biblical role of humans to care for the planet that God made and the diversity of life which he created. For, as I said, the threats to nature, to the home we call Earth, come mainly from ourselves, but as do many of the solutions. You can read or not read as much of that as you can while I'm talking. I'm not going to run through them all, but that's one schema of what it might take to address some of these things. Now, we might think that it would be obvious that Christians would be in the forefront of environmental research, policy, and action. But it hasn't felt to me as if that's the case. When I worked in the international development industry at Oxfam, there were many Christians involved in the organisation, even if it itself had left behind the Christian values of its founders and was pretty secular. And there were many Christian organisations prominent in the sector. There are 4 of them: Christian Aid, World Vision, Tear Fund, CAFOD. Whereas now, in the environmental sector, certainly internationally, of course there are some Christians involved, though it feels like a smaller proportion than in international development. And there are, I would say, very few major environmental organisations with Christian values or bases, other than a Rocha, of course. Though it's encouraging that, for example, the Executive Director of Friends of the Earth, my friend Andy Atkins, who's been there since 2008, is also an active Christian and formerly worked at Tearfund. And so I've reflected a bit, as I said earlier, on why this relative absence of Christians from the forefront of environmental concern. And I'll be interested in your thoughts and reflections on that later. But here's a couple of mine. Chris has outlined very coherently the biblical basis for environmental engagement. But I would acknowledge that there's a lot more emphasis in the Bible on justice and mercy, on poverty and finance, than there is directly on caring for creation, though that's certainly there as well. Now, some of my first theology degree and most of the second one were focused on church history. And we might also wonder, why is there a relative lack of ecological concern to be found there? Sure, there's some, but not that much. Well, I want to highlight two issues, not to say these are the two, but two for us to think about. Firstly, for extensive periods in Christian history, in various places at least, Christians were persecuted. And the consequence of that tended to be a focus on identity and on survival, not on stewardship responsibilities for the planet. And of course, as a persecuted minority, Christians were often not in a position to have much influence on the way humans treated the rest of creation. And as someone whose theology is significantly influenced by the Anabaptist tradition, that's the burning of Anneken Hendricks in Amsterdam in 1571, being pushed onto the flames, wonderfully in the shadow of the church. I'm conscious that, for example, early Anabaptist immigrants to Britain were generally either deported or executed, so they probably weren't too worried about the local ecology when they got here. But secondly, the fact is that environmental issues that existed up until the Industrial Revolution were not as significant, at least on a planetary scale, as they have been since then. And that's illustrated by this series of charts. The Anthropocene, as it's sometimes called, refers to the period of the Earth's history when it has become dominated by human activity. And it's perhaps taken us some time to realize what we've been doing to God's planet. You can see, interestingly, that population sure has increased, but the percentage increase there is nothing like the percentage increase in most of these other things. You know, McDonald's restaurants, to take an example, or motor vehicles, or mobile phones, or paper, etc., etc. So that might be driving some of it, but it's certainly not what's driving all of it. And some of those charts just give you a sense of the pace at which this is happening. And bear in mind, that's just going back to 1750, so not that long a time. So I think that means that, as a consequence, that these relatively recent emergence of environmental issues drives us back to biblical principles rather than directive texts to work out what should our response be to these new realities. So the Bible, as far as I'm aware, does not tell us unequivocally what use, if any, we should make of, say, GMOs or nuclear power or geoengineering. It says plenty of things about things that might be likened to those technologies, and there's plenty of material we can seek to apply, but nothing explicitly and directly about them. Again, the Bible has quite a lot to say about human greed and overconsumption, but it doesn't link that to effects on a planetary scale, because if you go back, the other 1,750 years or to whenever that particular bit of the Bible was being written, that wasn't the case. The planet as a whole, its systems were not being affected as they have been in recent years. But my own sense is that that makes theologizing about threats to the environment much more interesting, because we have to grapple with it. We have to work through what does God think about this. There aren't the directive texts that take us to a quick answer in that way. WWF's formal goal, as I mentioned earlier, is to build a future in which humans live in harmony with nature. Actually, that's the heart of a much longer statement. In the strategy review that I led shortly after joining the organisation 6 years ago, we captured that statement in 4 words: people and nature thrive. And one of the reasons that I like that formulation is that it seems to me that that is a consistent vision with God's view of what he wants for the world he's created, and of his vision of what that world will ultimately become, as Chris talked about, the vision in the book of Revelation. And interestingly, in the strategy renewal that we completed at WWF a few months ago, we retained that expression of our vision of the future. So just before I close, I'd like to show you a 1-minute video clip from WWF, which tries to capture visually something about what people and nature thriving might look like. Perhaps as Christians, we might just want to adjust that last caption to your world or God's world or something. But that's the kind of vision that I think Christians can share. And it's a vision that's captured there in the Bible, and in particular in the vision that Chris alluded to in the book of Revelation. Not of annihilation, but of a new earth. And that's something that offers us both encouragement for action today and hope for a future tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I knew when I suggested these 2 speakers for this evening, I knew that we would get a great speaker with Chris Wright, because I've heard Chris a number of times before. I was taking a bit of a long shot with you, David, because I'd not heard you speak before. But thank you. That has been absolutely fantastic and has stimulated us in lots of ways, I think. Chris, would you like to come up and join David here? And we're going to have another few minutes for questions. And first of all, if there are any questions directly to David on what he's just shared with us, and then we can open up the discussion a little bit more widely before we finish in here and then go through to refreshments. So any questions to David in particular? Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, as someone who's done church history, not me, but you, how true is it, do you think, that the church historically has used the Genesis story and that sort of us put in charge of creation as a means to dominate creation? I mean, you hear people talk that's been done, but I have no sense of knowing whether that's actually true. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, Chris may also have something to say on this. I mean, I think Genesis has been used extensively, legitimately and illegitimately to draw all kinds of conclusions over church history. And my own sense is that firstly we have to understand what the people, or the people who wrote and whose tradition that was, what did they understand by it, and what did they think it was teaching them. And it seems to me, if you look at the community of God's people in the Old Testament, the evidence we have in the Old Testament is that there was a lot of care for creation and concern about making sure that humans work with creation. I think there then became, well, different people would have different views on this, but I mean, my view would be that when Christians got power, particularly access to state power, they struggled with handling that in a Christian way. And then confused rather that power with a sort of approach of more domination. Having said that, to be clear, as I tried to illustrate, at that time, the issue of ecological degradation was very acute in very small local places, but nothing like what is happening now. In the Amazon rainforest or the forests of Papua New Guinea were not threatened by massive loggers and so on. So they weren't facing the same issues. But certainly I think the interpretation of Genesis has been misapplied in terms of the kind of role humans have in caring for God's creation as stewards, and has sometimes been interpreted in an exploitative way and justifying that, though there's certainly plenty of other stuff about the care side. I mean, just think of Francis of Assisi, for example. Chris, do you want to add something on that?
Well, only very briefly. I think from a church historical point of view, those who have studied this issue would say that the dominant position of the Christian faith right through until particularly the Enlightenment and the subsequent scientific and industrial revolution was one that Genesis mandated care for creation, not the destruction and pollution of creation. That two things I think contributed to in Western civilization, which of course had deep Christian roots, although it had gone very much astray with Christendom. One was when the science which was born within a Christian womb came to regard the natural world as purely stuff, as just material with no relationship to God or to human accountability to God for it. It was just there to be used, exploited in whatever way we want. But that was not derived from a Christian or a Genesis source, but from a materialistic understanding of reality. And secondly, and increasingly in this and the last century, by the ideology of consumerism, that stuff is there to be got, and the more we can get, the better it is. And so the accumulation of things and the greed element that is at the root of the sort of quasi-religion of consumerism has generated that exploitation of the earth is simply there for us to enjoy. So those would be two things I'd add.
Thank you, Chris. Next question. One right at the front who I know was waiting from beforehand. Just wait for the mic.
It's slightly a question of despair, because it seems to me, listening to you and from the books you've written, Chris, and what you're saying, that what you explain biblically and scientifically, there is no doubt. So my question is, how do we, I'm sure it's true for others here, how do we get our churches or other Christians on board? Because I'm not understanding why so many people in the church, I'm not talking outside, just seem to be turning a deaf ear. And so if you've any advice or any light you can shed on this, I would be very grateful.
That's a great question. Thank you. Chris, do you want to answer first? And
Well,
then David as well?
I do and I don't, because I honestly don't know the answer to that. I grieve over it as you do. I mean, I think there are signs of hope, and I wonder whether some of our friends in Rocha might be able to give examples of where churches have had their eyes opened and taken this up. And it can be hard work in some contexts, particularly those churches which are dominated by certain kinds of theology which resist this because they feel that this is not something Christians should be involved with, because we should only be concerned about, salvation of souls and so on. And those very important concerns which then become so dominant that they exclude anything else. That's sad. I don't know quite how to answer it, but I hope that organizations like Rocha and the Evangelical Environmental Network in the United States and so on are beginning to make waves and beginning to get heard. So I hope more power to them, I would say. But
yeah, I don't think I've got the answer either. I think finding practical ways. I think so. There's the practical, the theological, and the sort of campaigny bit, I think. And I think finding practical ways for congregations to engage is great. For some churches, that's starts with the churchyard round the building you have. How do you look after that? And it then may then go further. Then I think there's the theological strand, and then it's a question of can you influence those who do the teaching or who decide who does the teaching. And then there's the campaigning element, or the advocacy and getting involved in discussions of policy and so on. And there's a strong and long history of Christians being involved in all kinds of issues. Can we extend that to environment as well as social issues and poverty and so on? I think, though, that the fact that this is now an issue on a planetary scale should make that an easier case to make, because this is now an issue that ultimately will absolutely rebound on humans. I mean, we can already see, issues of food prices going up and so on because of environmental problems.
Thank you. I'll just chip in a tiny bit there. Again, I don't have the answers, and then got another question just over here. In terms of what Rocha is doing, I mean, Chris mentioned the Cape Town Commitment, which is part of the Lausanne movement, and that's one area at the global level that Rocha is trying to engage. So we've been part of helping the Lausanne movement have a special consultation on creation care that's now being rolled out into regional consultations so that key Christian leaders around the world are beginning to look at this, and that strategically can be very significant to help people realize this is a gospel issue within the Lordship of Jesus Christ. And then moving to the other end, to the local, Rocha UK at the moment is looking at its purposes and priorities and focusing on the church in the UK, and looking at the church in particular is something that Rocha UK is seeking to address in very specific ways. Some of you will know a quote that I quite often use from the late Rob Frost, who was a Methodist evangelist, that when Christians take the earth seriously, people take the gospel seriously. And when people actually see Christians caring for the earth, it seems to click in a way that the theology can help it click as well. But when people see Christians actually doing this, it seems to make a difference and it seems to connect. And so it's up to all of you, as much as it's up to any of us, as to how this actually works out in practice. We've got lots of hands up. We're not going to be able to have everybody's questions, but there's one just here, and then another one in the front row, and then I'll come and look over here in a second as well.
Thank you so much, both of you. I was very moved by your idyllic childhood, David, and very envious. A man with a name like Nussbaum, Nut Tree, was clearly spending a lot of time among the trees. And I wonder really, just to build a little bit on what David was saying, there are theological arguments and there are, economic arguments and there are geopolitical arguments. But as somebody who first grew something, I think at the age of 29, when I first put some radish seeds in the ground at the command of my then girlfriend, and danced around her garden 7 weeks later when these things came up magically. I wonder whether there's something about how we engender wonder And I wonder how you've done that within your own families. How do we engender wonder amongst our own families, wonder in our church congregations, so that this is impelled not merely, in a sense, by an argument, but by a heartfelt wonder, which is really what I got from that first half of your idyllic Peter, Eeyore, Tigger, Wood thing.
Yeah, I even managed at Cambridge to have a year in Walnut Tree Court. I thought that was very appropriate. It's always, for me at least, it's always difficult. I like the word engender in our children because, if you sort of push too hard, they have this, or at least ours do, I don't know where they get it from, habit of sort of pushing back. So for me, that was about many of the holidays we had being, spending time outside, for us in North Wales very often, climbing mountains and seeing views and so on. You get into issues of cost and carbon, but there are some wonderful parts of the world you can travel to. Though if we all do that, it could get a bit difficult, and we certainly didn't do that with our kids very much. But I think finding ways to allow them to experience nature, and then in the end they have to sort of find for themselves whether this is inspirational. But I mean, and different people are different, aren't they? For me, views are very important. Being able to see views and so on, and to encounter those. And I love your thing about radishes. I used to like radishes because they only take a month or two to grow, whereas, other things, a whole season, and I'm sort of impatient.
Yeah, I do think it is something that can start very young. I mean, many of us will know that John Stott's, the origin of his love for nature was from his father. I mean, his father took him out for walks in the countryside and told him when he was chattering away as a little child, shut your mouth and open your eyes, and apparently, that's what he says. And from that childhood experience, he developed a love for the natural world, which obviously then sustained him all through his life. I mean, one of my two sons is here, and he could testify to this, that certainly when we were out camping and doing all that kind of thing when they were kids, they got fed up with me. We'd walk along the country lanes or the roadside, and I'd point to all the little flowers and then start quoting the Bible, consider the flowers of the field and the birds of the air. They sow not, neither did they toil, but not even Solomon in all his splendor was arrayed like one of these, and say, yes, Dad, But I can't help hoping, at least, that something of that sense of the wonder of creation and the joy of it and the simplicity of it and just that it's there, and we get up every morning and the world is there and the soil is there and the trees are there and it's still there, to me is a wonderful thing, and it's something we should instill in people because it doesn't cost anything to see that.
Just one other thing. I mean, I think one thing we do have now is amazing films. On the BBC Natural History series, for example. And I think one of the challenges there is, how to go beyond just simply sitting and watching. But at least that is an opportunity to see the incredibleness of the created world.
Thank you, all of you. And we've got another question here, and then one in the middle, and we're going to stop after that simply because of time. But if we could keep the questions and the answers fairly brief, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. Less perhaps a question, but more of a comment. I don't think we can close a discussion about getting churches involved without mentioning eco-congregation, which is, of course, Rocha's very own grassroots, bottom-up way of engaging people both locally and internationally with environmental issues. I spent several days last week at the Diocesan Environment Officers Conference, an annual conference with Church of England, where a representative from almost every diocese was there. One of the main things that came out of that conference was a discussion on the lack of interest of the 5 marks of mission, even among churches which concentrate their efforts very much on mission, where the 5th mark of mission is all about environment. striving to maintain the integrity of the earth and things like that. And I do think we need to go back to some of these things which are now, 30 or more years old and have been neglected.
Thank you. I think both of those are really helpful things. If you want to know more about eco-congregation, ask any of the Rocha people afterwards. Now, there was a lady right in the middle who had her hand up. If we could get the mic to her, and we're going to finish with this question or comment, I think.
Yes, historically, you highlighted a persecution as a factor in restricting theological reflection and input. We live in times where persecution of Christians is widespread in some parts of the world today. Do you think this is similarly a restricting factor in our development of our thinking and action in these other areas?
Well, I think if I was a Christian in North Korea, I probably would struggle to spend too much of my time on ecological concerns because of the enormous pressure there would be. That doesn't mean it's out of the window completely. If you've got a garden, you can care for it, sort of thing. But I want to recognise that reality, and actually, around places around the world, Christians have always been being persecuted. We've also done our fair share of the persecuting as well at times. So I suppose I'm not wanting to use that as an excuse, but at least to recognise that changes your perspective, and to some degree Christian theology, quite a bit of Christian theology, has either come from groups who were being persecuted or from groups who had enormous power. And my observation would be that neither group has always done terribly well at dealing with environmental issues. I think that there's also a sense, though, that if we can inspire people, even when under persecution, with some of what Chris was talking about, that sense of the glory that's shown in creation, that can also be something very important for them to hold on to when much of life is very difficult. There is still God's creation there to wonder at.
Thank you. Am I right in thinking that Rocha does have groups, movements in some countries in the world where Christians are persecuted?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, for instance, there has been persecution of Christians in India, and including attacks on churches in Bangalore, which is where Rocha India is based.
And in the Middle East?
And in the Middle East, in the Lebanon, for instance, yes.
I'm not sure about Indonesia yet, but...
Not yet.
But all I was trying to make from that point is that I think there are places where Christians exist in context of persecution, and this message is not unheard of. In other words, there can be, if there's good biblical teaching, people can take the creation seriously even when they are struggling in violent situations. It's not necessarily something they just forget about, because it's
I was just thinking about that, and in Jeremiah 29, when the people of Israel are a persecuted minority in exile, asylum seekers and refugees in Babylon, the first thing that God tells them to do is plant gardens and eat what they produce. So there's a sense in which putting down your roots, whatever your situation, is something that we're called to do. Anyway, thank you once again, both of you. Thank you also for questions. Thank you for coming.